Hello and welcome to the second interview coming from the Idyllwild Forest Health Project's Mental Hygiene series, workshop series. Today, I'm interviewing Kent Weishaus. He is a licensed clinical social worker and has had a private practice in Idyllwild since 2012. He has worked in mental hospitals, community clinics, schools, and served as an adjunct professor at Cal State Los Angeles for 5 years, teaching social work theory and practice classes to master degree students. Prior to Kent's switch to a helping profession, he had a 25-year career in television production, directing and working with many celebrities and actors, writing and producing promotions and teases, interacting with numerous network executives, finance and legal personnel, and supervising hundreds of crew members. I would think all that work in Hollywood would set you up for working with for psychotherapy work.
Yeah, well, some of my work was to help people stay calm in that environment, although I was not always that successful myself during those years at staying calm.
No. Well, that seems to be true in all of this practice, is that we're not always capable of, keeping the calmest head. But speaking of which, so you are doing a workshop on Saturday, and it's titled "Feel Like You Need a Referee for the Committee in Your Head? Inner conflicts and critics are normal and can be harmonized with good tools. Find peace in the story." And that'll be this Saturday at 10:30 at Town Hall, 25925 Cedar Street in Idyllwild. So that's a great title, and I'm really very much looking forward to talking about what some of that means as we get deeper into this interview. But I wanted to open up with some sort of more broader questions for people maybe who have never been to a therapist, or they have been to it and it wasn't, have been to a therapist and it wasn't necessarily successful, or they didn't get much out of it. Why go to a therapist in the first place? Why do therapy at all? Is it just to cheer ourselves up so we can go out and shop more?
No, that's what television production is for.
Find our unbearable job more unbearable, to be more bearable. What's the point of it? Or yeah.
That's good. You're hitting on some key points there. One of the primary things therapy can do is provide a strong, validating social connection. And we are social creatures. The point of therapy is most of the time, when a person feels that their functioning within their social or professional worlds is suffering, is not, and also inner worlds. If their functioning is not allowing them to accomplish what they want to, that is probably the time to come to a therapist. If not, some other valid intervention, which could be yoga work or meditation, or if there's some competent shaman in your community. But therapy is a good way that in this culture to help improve functioning.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting you brought up shamans or shamans. I've been listening to John Vervaeke's, it's called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. He's a cognitive neuroscientist from the University of Toronto, and he basically gives like a 46,000 year history, starting with the Upper Paleolithic transition of the psychotechnologies that humans developed over time as populations grew and so on, But starting with shamanism, and kind of could really see how the roots of this kind of work is really rooted in shamanism, and how the groups that had a shaman with them tended to outcompete other groups in terms of doing, getting along better. If you have a shaman around, thanks to the placebo effect, at least you're more likely to survive a health illness and things like that.
Sure. Well, it's interesting. The placebo effect is simply the effect of believing that I have something that is meaningful and believable to me. That's the basis of most or all of our collaborations, ancient and modern.
There's this growing understanding right now that we are perhaps in a meaning crisis. And I'm wondering about therapy as, not just a matter of feeling better and getting over these various complexes, but also as helpful in terms of discovering meaning in life, meaning and purpose.
Yeah, well, I think one implies the other. To have a crisis of functioning almost always points to a crisis of meaning, a crisis of being able to make sense out of what's going on. Yeah.
And here we are in this crisis, in a mental health crisis, as you're saying, interconnected or interweaved with that. And yet, the cost of therapy is kind of out of reach for a lot of people. The cost of spending an hour with a therapist. There is this divide, as in so many things in our reality, our market-based reality right now. This is one reason we're doing this workshop series, is to bring some of these tools to everyone. Any thoughts about that whole issue?
Well, which side of it? The commodification of therapy and medicine in general, or how to get tools on your own?
Well, the commodification part, that's a huge subject. We could go down that rabbit hole for a while, but how about how to get tools on your own?
Right. Yeah, well, workshops like this are a real good way. And my colleagues, Robin, Kara, and the others, Cindy, we can share ideas and modes of intervention and ways that people can help themselves. And much of what we have to offer is something that people can pursue on their own. I mean, just the way that you can pick up a book and learn from it. But sometimes it may be difficult to actually make a change. So it's the crisis of insight. I have the insight, I've read it, I have the knowledge. Now, how do I act on it? If there's difficulty acting on it, you may want to get into a therapeutic situation that helps you act on it, helps you move in the direction you want to go.
It's almost like we need an expansive coaching system for people, and maybe people could learn how to coach one another as well.
Yeah. Human Relations 101, in my opinion, should be part of core educational curriculum from kindergarten. But and that would go a long way, I think, towards helping people function in a world that's very confusing. But we don't have that. So instead, you have therapists.
Yeah, I only recently started becoming aware of this concept of adult development. And my understanding is that even in psychotherapy up through the 70s, it was kind of like child development, and then you become an adult, and then it's over almost. And, so what do you think? But it seems like obviously development continues as adults. We continue, and then we got different, we mentioned, I bring this up because you mentioned Robert Keegan in a recent conversation, and he's got his whole theory. Yeah, in our group, our first group meeting, when I first met you, you touched on him.
Okay.
And he's got his theory of adult development. There's people that have these ideas of stages, and then other people like Nora Bateson are kind of opposed to the idea of stages, because they think it can be kind of hierarchical, like, oh, which stage are you in? People can get all kind of tied up in that. But
Right.
what's your thinking around the idea of adult development?
Well, I like the idea of stages. I like the idea of giving names to things that seem to be intangible. Erik Erikson's stages of development have been very useful to my own training. But I would also agree that when you give a label to something, it can lead you into a distortion that, oh, you haven't accomplished this task, so you can't move on to the next one. It's we can get stuck stigmatizing, judging people. Oh, he hasn't moved on to that development phase. But in fact, you may find people who have achieved development goals, yet from time to time relapse to previous developmental behaviors, which kind of goes back to how you originally introduced me. We are made up of a number of different parts, and biological and psychological, and they overlap. So when you have a functioning person who once in a while has a tantrum, they're going back to a 3 or 4-year-old behavior, right? And then if they come out of the tantrum and they start functioning again, that's great. Except that from a behavior standpoint, people around them may be going, oh God, he may not be that trustworthy. He has tantrums, right? Which is a reversion to an earlier stage of development. And a part of that person that fuses with them because some need is not being met. So the part fuses with them, takes over. I'm just pulling this out of an example out of thin air, but has a tantrum, and then the part unfuses and they get back to normal functioning, but people around them say, oh, that behavior is not that trustworthy. So that's an example of struggling with functioning in the world. So part of one of the elements of internal family systems and parts work, which I'm a big fan of, is that if we revert to earlier developmental behaviors, modes of functioning that are not adaptive, generally those parts are trying to protect us from some other kind of pain, or they may actually be the pain taking over. So.
Right, and it seems like this can also happen on a societal level, right? Where you can have a society when dealing with a lot of stress or uncertainty, as happens during some of these big paradigm shifts, like the move to modernity in the 19th century. You can have masses of people kind of like yearning for a more authoritarian ruler to kind of like tell them what to do.
It's an interesting way of looking at it, because you're talking about social systems now.
Like a regression in a social system, yeah.
Right, social systems interact with our systems and parts all the time. And so how do we interact with them? And are they adaptive? Are they going to be helpful in the long run?
Well, let's chat about, if it's okay, I would like to talk about men for a moment, because it seems right now that men are in crisis in our country and maybe beyond as well. 3 times more likely to die of a death of despair, drug abuse, suicide, alcoholism. In terms of college, back in 1972, when Title IX legislation was passed to give women a leg up in terms of the numbers that were graduating. Men were 13 more likely to get 13 points more likely to get a college degree than a woman. Today, it's 15 points more likely that a woman will get a college degree than a man. High school GPA, which is kind of an important indicator of future capacity, ability to go to college and types of work people will get. The top 10% of the top 10% performers, 2/3 are girls. The bottom 10% performers, 2/3 are boys. On and on and on in terms of data. Are you witnessing this, experiencing this in your practice?
I would say not so much, but that's only because my practice is limited. One thing we did in your introduction to me, I'm semi-retired. I work 2 days a week. And I do not have many male clients, to be honest with you. I have a few. And in the past, of course, I've had a lot more. But I will say that we all live under a social umbrella with great unspoken expectations, unspoken rules. And men, the idea of the male persona, the masculine persona, being able to tolerate or do certain tasks or not do other tasks as well, or to behave in a certain way, certainly comes to bear on men that I've worked with, and with women. I try, and I have many, or I have had over the years, a number of women who, in my view, have come under the negative influences of a patriarchal umbrella. Now, I hope I don't get myself into trouble for saying that, but there are unspoken rules, and certainly that were a lot more rigid in the past 70 years than they are now, that greatly traumatized and negatively affected many women. And I'm hoping that those numbers will be less, but I'm not totally convinced.
Yeah.
I don't know. Did that answer your question, or am I?
Well, it's just it is in today's climate. It's almost like it seems like on the one hand, on the left, you have the left seems to be turning its backs on this issue for fear of betraying their commitment to women's equality, which is, not something we would want to do. And on the right, there seems to be this kind of magical thinking that we're just going to go back to like the old traditional ways where everyone kind of knew their place. This is something that Richard Reeves points out in this book, a new book of Boys and Men. And what he's calling for is that we need a model of mature masculinity that's compatible with gender equality. And then maybe that means
I would completely
men
agree
learning to be good fathers. Like maybe men can be nurturing as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah,
I bring it up partly because we have not had a lot of men coming to these workshops. Very few in terms of the ratio, and looking at the statistics, it just seems like, and I think it is also in the upper up people in the professional managerial class. They see women coming into the workplace, and they're seeing the positives of all this. And this is not to say there are any negatives in that at all. We want equality for women, of course. But I think this is sort of a more hidden problem. People are kind of falling behind, from the industrialized reality prior to the current globalized, digitalized, marketplace.
Right. Well, yeah. Part of something that constrains our talk here is that we are speaking from our cultural point of view that gives value to a jobs marketplace. I just finished David Graeber's book called, I'm not sure if I can swear on this, but Bullshit Jobs. And his point is that most of us just don't need to work that hard. The work that we do gets done in 5 or 10 hours a week, and we don't have to be on the job for 40 hours. And that the whole idea of ownership of another person's time while they're on the job is increasingly fallacious. And so anyway, from the system's point of view, we are giving value to women coming into the jobs market, but taking a step further back, is the jobs market, the way we have it, that valuable?
Right. Yeah. And then with automation coming, I forget the name of the Yale philosopher, but he's basically said no human should do what a machine can do instead. Like humans should be freed up to
exactly
do more meaningful things with their lives than act like a machine for 40 hours a week.
Exactly. Self-actualization is a word that therapists have used. The idea that we don't spend time on repetitive, unpleasant tasks at work, that we spend our precious time living on this planet, doing things that are positive, self-actualizing, things that make us feel good and that are good for the people around us and the group within which we function. So going back to the jobs market, if somebody may have really enjoy their job and be struggling in it, and so if someone's enjoying their job, that is a form of self-actualization. I'll try and help them, move towards behaviors or jobs that give them more balance, more internal balance. So
now, just one more quick thing on that. Men seem to be moving out of the therapy profession, and it seems to be more and more women, and that seems like a loss in a way. Like it would be great to have men doing care work too.
I haven't studied those statistics. Although I will say, just from my own experience, it may be true in Idyllwild, but I do see men in the therapeutic field at, I guess, a consistent minority numbers. I don't know if they're growing. I don't feel that they're shrinking, but I don't know that they're growing. When the paradigm, the shamanistic paradigm in the earlier part of the 20th century was that psychiatrists did therapy. And in the middle of the century, it became more that marriage and family therapists and social workers, and now in the 21st century, counselors, so you can get a counseling degree. These people are doing the therapy. So when it was psychiatrists, it may have been more dominated by men because they had to have an MD.
Mhm. Yeah, the old stereotype of a psychiatrist was some man with a glasses and a beard, kind of doodling on his pad while somebody went on about their life. And
Right, right.
yeah, well, so let's get into your work. And you wrote in terms of your presentation. Again, this is kind of getting back to what you've already touched on. That there are a great many biological and psychological systems work together to keep us alive, and there are our different parts. And I looked in a little bit to Richard Schwartz and internal family systems work, and he describes these three parts or three general types of parts as exiles, managers, and firefighters. Is that something you'd like to get into? Is that?
Sure.
Yeah.
I hope I can do it justice. So an exile is a deeply wounded part, is a deeply wounded and painful part that our protective parts will help us from touching. We can't be with that part. It's just too painful. So I'm going to protect you by having you get angry, or by having you focus on something exclusively, and to the detriment of other things around you, your family or your job. Managers try and work really hard to keep you away from exiles, the deeply pained parts, and firefighters are parts that are extremely reactive. We're about to touch an exile. We have to go to extreme measures to make sure that doesn't happen. So a temper tantrum, a blow up, some extreme maladaptive behavior. It could be an intense crying jag. It could be just a freezing. I can't move, and I'm having a panic attack. My heart is racing. I just can't move. I can't do anything. Those tend to be firefighters.
Also addictions, right? Yeah, overeating and so on.
Yeah. Well, those are more managers. Those are more, if we have a persistent overeating behavior, or drinking, or using drugs behavior, we're managing this. We're keeping you away from the more pained parts.
It's almost like we're all Sibyl.
Interesting. Yeah. So there was a recent article in the New York Times, which I considered quite unhelpful, questioning the whole idea of parts theory, and saying that we're all just one personality, and this is all bunk. And I'm sorry, the idea of the singular personality in my experience is greatly overrated. And this is evidenced by our own experience right now. A part of me wants to get up and go have a cup of coffee downstairs, okay? But another part of me is saying, no, stay here and do this interview with Mark. And those are manifestations of my sub-personalities. And they're not particularly dysfunctional, because the part that says stay here and interview with Mark is doing fine. But if I was to get up and have a cup of coffee because of great fear or something like that, perhaps I could be called dysfunctional.
We could take a break so you can get a cup of coffee.
No, that's all right. I'll stick with water. Thank you.
So Richard Schwartz talks about this idea that none of these are bad characters, and that part of the goal is to allow them all to. Exactly.
Go. So they have a common goal. They have a common goal to keep us functioning. Our parts. And incidentally, functional MRIs have shown of the brain and even of how it connects to different parts of the body, that there's correlations between visceral feelings and what comes into our cerebral cortex as a thought. So our parts do manifest biologically. There's evidence that they're there. This is not necessarily just a metaphoric discussion. It's where metaphor and biology come together. And so it's important to try and be in touch with your various parts, so that you have an understanding of, oh, why am I feeling this mood? Why am I having this thought repeatedly? To try and look at what that part might be protecting you from, and how you might want to improve functioning by loving that part of you because it's trying to protect you, but also integrating it. Yes, that's part of me, but it doesn't have to drive the bus. So when he talks about they're not harmful, he's right. I mean, it's the idea is these parts make us up. They are us. They come together. He also talks about I can't remember his exact term, a wise self, right? That arguably could be cerebral cortex wisdom, being able to take in input from different parts, and say, okay, what's best for me right now? What's best for us right now, for health and safety. And so, yes, to love those parts of yourself is important. So many times people come to me and say, oh, that weak, sad part of me, I just want to get rid of it. Oh, God, it's just in my way. It makes me cry, And it's like, that's oddly, it's counterintuitive. This is a wounded part that it would likely be beneficial to come to know and be able to learn to nurture yourself. And that's the hard part. The exiles, which are wounded parts of us, were likely wounded earlier in life and did not have the kind of validating support that we talked about earlier. And how do we learn to be self-validating to those wounded parts? Or at least to seek out validation in our immediate environment. That's also helpful. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. When I was in my 20s, I experienced my fair share of trauma as growing up, and kind of emerged in a big way in my 20s when I was at university, and I would freeze, especially around the time that I had to turn in papers. Sure. And I went to a therapist who did, as I mentioned in my last interview with Cindy, emotional body work. And one of the things that was extremely helpful for me and really stuck with me was this idea that the freezing part is not necessarily a weak part that I need to just, push out of the way and get the work done. It's a really powerful, force. And rather than trying to kind of dominate it or whatever, he said, when I'm lying there, and I would literally lie there sometimes for hours, just stuck.
Frozen, yeah.
Yeah, and he said, just wiggle your fingers a little bit and say to yourself, I can wiggle my fingers. And, I've had, much more minor bouts of that over the years. But just that reminder to just sort of be gentle with that self and even respectful of it was enormously helpful for me.
Yeah. And Cindy's work and her orientation with somatic experiencing, Peter Levine's mode of work, is really, really valuable because freezing is just a classic mammalian response to danger.
Yeah.
And we stigmatize and pathologize it. But when our ancestors were threatened, freezing could save their life.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, you have to write a college paper and you got to get it done by 8 a.m. tomorrow morning. Feels like there's a tiger breathing down your neck who's about to eat you. And so that enters into another thing that I'm going to be talking about in my presentation, which is thought distortions. Your therapist and saying to wiggle your fingers, I can wiggle my fingers, is like beginning to sort of put the foot in the door of saying, you know, the door's not totally closed. You can open this a little bit, and commence functioning again, as opposed to freezing. Part of that, and the freeze is not necessarily a thought distortion. It is a state of being, right? That you don't understand. I'm frozen. I'm going to sit here. I'm going to continue to stare at the wall. And how the idea of seeing that as a functional distortion can be useful also. Cindy's work and Peter Levine's work from a somatic point of view is invaluable. From a cognitive point of view, that you can also approach it that way and say, and take a look at what am I feeling right now? What am I thinking right now? And what cognitive behavioral therapy doesn't necessarily do is understand the etiology of the feeling. Where is it coming from? Which I think somatic experiencing helps with. But cognitive therapy would help bring that feeling out into the open. I'm frozen. I'm staring at the wall. The feeling is probably numbness, right? What would you prefer to think? To just get distance from that. That's a part of you that's taken over, right? What would you prefer to do right now? Even if you can't, what would you prefer to? Well, I prefer to get up, have that cup of coffee, and write my paper. And so just by allowing that thought to come into your mind, you may be able to develop it. Now, but you are at the risk of pushing away the frozen part, which is trying to protect you. So to step back a little bit further, am I really in danger here? I guess I'm in danger of failing. That's a danger, but am I going to lose? Am I in bodily danger? Am I in grave danger of losing my life? No. The danger isn't really as bad as I'm telling myself it is, and I can choose a different thought to go with, choose a different thought, which will likely lead to a different feeling, a feeling that allows for more functionality.
You mentioned when I asked about influences, Aaron Beck and David Burns and their list of cognitive distortions, which I ran into a couple years ago, and I would recommend to everybody that you take a look at this list, because I think they're kind of on a spectrum, but to some degree, I think we all do a little bit perhaps of all of these. It's and a lot of some of them. The overgeneralization, the all or nothing thinking that you mentioned. I've got the list here. Jumping to conclusions, fortune telling. It's a list of 16 different ways in which we can just completely fool ourselves and end up down a rabbit hole if it becomes serious enough.
And these are, more often than not, our parts trying to protect us by holding a belief close that is distorted. And so to understand that this part is trying to protect you by saying, I know what he's thinking. I can read his mind. Is trying to protect you, but in fact, from some other kind of fear of judgment, pain, something like that. To be able to step back and say, no, wait a minute, I really can't read anyone's mind. I see how he's behaving, and that behavior strikes me as a certain way, but I don't know what he's actually thinking. So more nuanced, more shade of gray. I also hope to spend a little time speaking about the further development of cognitive distortions that was done by Daniel Kahneman and his partner Tversky. One of the more important concepts they came up with is fast and slow thinking. So fast thinking is more primitive thinking. It's more, I need an answer right now, and I've got it, bang. As opposed to slow thinking, which is sort of necessary to use the cognitive distortions worksheet with yourself, to be able to step back and say, wait a minute, I understand, I'm believing this right now, but is there something I'm not, is there some system I'm not seeing here that's coming into play? That's slow thinking. That's human analytic thinking that is quite valuable. It's what defines our species. We aren't entirely reactive the way most mammals can be seen as being. We have the ability to think about our thinking.
It's interesting. I was struck when I was reading the the accolades that Kahneman gets. He's clearly a giant in the field, and actually several fields, right, or a couple, more than one.
Yeah, that's because the economists love him. He got the Nobel Prize in economy in 2001. Economics in 2001, because his distortions are directly applicable to people who think about money and investing.
Yeah, and the whole idea, he kind of blew away the whole idea that humans are rational. But
right.
What I was struck by reading some of these accolades is they act as though he came up with this, but Plato, way back in the day, had this whole idea of that there's the monster and there's the rational mind and so on. And one of the things that Plato, that I find so intriguing about what he suggested, was this idea of the lion, which is shame and pride. And that, so Plato's idea was the man inside, this is Greece, so it's patriarchal language, but the idea that the man kind of could see in the future, sort of do more long-term thinking and think rationally about what would be for the good in a longer term sense. Then there's the monster that just wants it now, that's instinct and so on. And then there's this idea of the lion, which is community, really, the idea that we don't, and this, so the pride and shame, and the community can shame you, but it can also, lift you up. Right. And this sort of idea has been used by Weight Watchers and so on. Like, if you're having an issue like overeating or something, you can join a community, and through the community, kind of mitigate that or regulate that through your sense of wanting to fit in with other people. Does Kahneman have that idea? Like, I like that idea of sort of connecting the sort of individual struggle with connecting to community.
Interesting thought. Not that I can recall. He does talk about groupthink, where communities can share a deluded belief to really an unhelpful end. But not so much in a positive way that I can recall. I'm more focused on how he takes the Beck distortions and, in my opinion anyway, parses them out a little bit more. Confirmation bias is very big with him. If you believe something, you are going to go to certain ends, consciously or unconsciously, to validate that belief.
Well, and with social media and so on, we're in an era of confirmation porn. I've heard it expressed
Well
as
put.
such.
Yeah, well put.
Yeah, where people just post whatever and it all gets confirmed by everyone who's their
Right.
friend, and then anyone who doesn't is an idiot, basically.
Right. And that does, point towards, we need more system 2 thinking. We need more thinking that says, wait a minute, my friend posted this. Yeah, we have similar beliefs, but are there systems around us we're not paying attention to here enough? Are there other factors at play? You mentioned Plato talking about shame and what was it? Pride.
Pride,
Pride.
the
Pride and shame.
lion.
Right, the lion. So shame is permeating the culture. To a very harmful degree, in my opinion. And people internalize the shame, and they get it from families, communities, nations, certainly on social media, where somebody gets quote unquote canceled. You're so shameful, we're never going to pay attention to you. Shame there's a huge trap of black and white thinking there. That and I say this because people internalize shame that I work with to a very unhelpful degree. That whenever anyone says I'm ashamed of this, I try and help them reframe it to, you may regret that. You may regret that, you were part of this, or you did this by accident or on purpose. But regret is different than shame, where I have no value as a human.
Yeah, that's Brene Brown territory.
That's right. That's right. I'm a big fan of Brene Brown.
Yeah.
She has a great special on Netflix that I recommend everyone to see.
Oh, yeah. Circling back to the cognitive distortions, one of the things that's interesting to me about that is it reminds me of the Buddhist meditation practice of naming, kind of as things coming up, calling, but in a much more, like they really get into like really technical descriptions. So on that note, you also mentioned Daniel Siegel as an important influence in his mindfulness work at UCLA. Is that?
Yeah, well, this goes back to the parts work as well. When we were talking about Richard Schwartz's approach to parts and managers, firefighters, and exiles, that we have these many parts of us. Siegel, as a neuropsychiatrist, actually approaches it from, we can see where these parts are to some degree within us biologically. One of the great sources of anxiety in my work are people holding opposing beliefs within themselves. I feel so bad that I didn't do something. If I had done something, I would have been injured. And these opposing beliefs create anxiety. There's like a Grand Canyon, there's a gulf between them. And these are different parts talking to you. And so the idea of allowing two things to be true at the same time that are polar opposites within us. This is another thing that we are capable of doing, observing our thoughts. As the as the self-aware consciousness allows us to allow the two opposing beliefs within us are true. And yes, it doesn't make sense, but they're both there, and I can be with that. Siegel would talk about integration. That is a form of integration, to allow that different parts may have different agendas and different opposite feeling states, but they're both true, and it's okay to love them both. So the idea that we integrate different parts of us, and the idea that being able to look at your thoughts and give them metaphoric form, whether it's a tube coming out of your head or thought bubbles or something that works as a visual for you, can actually give you distance from them. Oh, there's the thought that says, I've got an interview with Mark right now. Be nervous about that, you know? And I can step back and go, oh, okay, yeah, that's, and by doing so, the idea of being nervous just drops a notch or two, you know?
Yeah, well, Mara and I are both 1 year into Sam Harris's meditation app called Waking Up.
Oh.
And it's the process I think it's based in Vipassana meditation.
Okay.
But the process he takes you through in each meditation is very much what you're describing. The influences are all over the place in terms of the different he has different meditation teachers and so on, and he's clearly done this kind of work that you're describing, where there's this sort of stepping back. Sometimes you're focusing just on what you're seeing, either with eyes closed or not, but sort of widening the gaze, and then
That's
kind of
valuable. I will look into it. I'm a fan of Sam Harris's. So.
Oh, well, the app is, we love the app. Yeah. I'm not completely on, but I think he's a little bit heavy on the atheism.
Yeah, he does tend to go down that road a lot. But well, that's the thing. You can harvest what works for you.
Yeah.
On the one hand, media, internet, and social media may have a lot more negative than positive. On the other hand, you're able to instantly access guys like Daniel Siegel, Richard Schwartz, Sam Harris, and harvest from them what really works well from you in this day and age. In another day and age, it might have taken years to accumulate that information. Yeah,
it's amazing. There are a lot of trade-offs with it, but there's also just a wealth of possibilities with what's there. So just to kind of wind this up, you touched on this, well, a few times, and a lot of what your work is related to systems thinking and integrating, within us different, these different parts and so on. Well, that's very much kind of why, I mean, this fits in beautifully with what we are trying to do with the Idyllwild Forest Health Project, where we see the health of the forest as being interconnected with the health of the people, systems within systems in the forest and within the human community, everything between government, the Forest Service, and different people's personal political beliefs and ideologies, and just how to get all these disparate parts integrating with one another for the sake of health and flourishing in the community, right. Ecologically and in the human community and socially. So, and we sort of see that as part of a larger picture of, where we are right now with all these different crises, and the climate crisis being an important one, of course, if not
perhaps the most important.
Yeah, although now,
if we're going to survive.
Yeah, although now some people are saying AI is potentially even more dangerous than the climate crisis in terms of what's looming ahead. But we don't have to get into all that.
Theoretical for me. But
yeah.
okay.
But anyway, so Do you agree, or do you see that the practices that you're describing and the work you're doing as being helping us along the path of integrating more of these?
Yes, that's perhaps one of my, if not the greatest goal when I work with people. They tend to be, fractionalized. They tend to be at odds with parts within themselves. And so the idea of integration helps make sense, helps provide a cohesive story, a cohesive narrative to their lives, or at least more cohesive, so that they're able to collaborate with others more effectively, to be with others, to hold helpful beliefs with others more effectively.
We really appreciate that you are coming and really donating your time, in the sense that we're only covering your travel costs. So I want to thank you for that. That's generous on your part. And yeah, thank you very much. And I hope.
Thanks for having me. I'm honored to be asked to participate within this valuable experience that is available to the Idyllwild community.
All right. Well, we can leave it there, and I will wish you a great workshop on Saturday. Again, that's at Town Hall in Idyllwild.